Liv, welcome to the Future of Life Institute podcast. It's great to have you on.
Thank you for having me.
Many of my listeners will know you, but for those who don't, perhaps you could introduce yourself.
I originally studied physics, astrophysics in particular. Had plans to become a researcher. I really loved physics and particularly anything to do with space and the universe. But those plans went kind of awry when I took some time off to try and just explore the world a little bit. And I started playing on TV game shows, and because I always just loved games and I always thought I'd be good at them. And it was on one of these game shows that I learned to play poker. I loved poker so much that I then put physics on hold to see if I could become a professional poker player. So I ended up being a professional poker player for 10 years or so. But during this time, I also got interested in philanthropy. Some other poker players and I started a fundraising organization for highly cost-effective charities called Raising for Effective Giving. And during the course of that, I started to learn more and more about global catastrophic risk, existential risks, particularly those posed by emerging technologies. And then I sort of got so passionate about this. Well, and also I at some point started falling out of love with poker a little bit. So I ended up retiring about technically 2019, but I kind of stopped playing in 2018. And now work kind of full time as kind of, I guess, a sort of science communicator and filmmaker to raise awareness of some of the game theoretic drivers, the risks that our civilization is facing, and then particularly the mechanism that's driving these risks. And I mostly do that through my YouTube channel and other social media platforms.
And this leads nicely into the main idea for this podcast, which is Moloch. So what do we mean when we say Moloch? What is that?
Yeah, so it's kind of an esoteric concept in that, so it was originally, comes from this old Bible story where legend has it there was this horrible cult who wanted to win so badly, win wars and expand their power so badly that they would sacrifice the thing they loved the most to this demon god called Moloch, and that was their children. So really, really awful. So it became known as this god of war and sacrifice. Pretty nasty things. But then more recently, in popular culture, it sort of reemerged again. First of all, through the silent film Metropolis that was made in 1927, which sort of talked about this seemingly utopian city that underground was driven by this sort of dark, scary machine that consumed workers in order to keep everything running. And the protagonist sees this machine as the god Moloch. And then Allen Ginsberg wrote a poem about it in the 1960s, sort of seemingly comparing it to something akin to capitalism, but there's something else as well. And then Scott Alexander of Slate Star Codex wrote this amazing blog post called Meditations on Moloch, which dissected Allen Ginsberg's poem. And that was the first time that it ever got sort of directly linked to a dark force of game theory and of coordination failure and race to the bottom scenarios. I'm now trying to sort of popularize this meme through videos because, I think it's such an important concept. And I don't see anyone talking about it on video. So that's sort of its story arc of how it became known in popular culture. But what it actually is, therefore, I don't necessarily think it's actually like a conscious demon god that's causing all the world's problems. But in effect, it is the game theoretic forces that it sort of constitutes really are causing many of our big problems.
Yeah, I think it's nice to take a couple of examples here. And one example you've brought to my attention, at least, is this issue of beauty filters on social media. So perhaps explain how beauty filters is an instance of a Moloch type situation.
I'm a person who uses Instagram probably too much. And particularly, 5-10 years ago when I was still trying to build my profile and, I was trying to make it as a sort of trying to build fame as a poker player. There was I noticed that if I posted a picture that's with some, as sort of a pretty picture that's not necessarily of myself and that had some kind of intellectual content, it wouldn't get that many likes. Whereas if I posted a sexy picture of myself, it would get tons of attention and likes. And I was like, huh, interesting. And then a few years ago, they started releasing these AI beauty filters that would, just sort of subtly tweak and enhance your face, not like a form of digital makeup, almost like a form of digital plastic surgery. And I remember like trying these out and then noticing, I would input a picture of myself that I already liked. I thought I looked cute in. But then after I passed it through the filter, I would then like compare the side by side, and I would hate the old photo. So basically it would make me hate my natural face. And yet again, I noticed if I posted pictures with the filter on, they would get even more likes and more attention. And then I noticed that clearly other influencers were using these things too. And so this, got me thinking. I was like, wow, this is a perfect manifestation of this Moloch thing, because the way it works is basically if you're in some kind of competitive situation. So in this case, you're trying to outcompete other influencers on Instagram to get more, more likes, more followers. Because it's ultimately it is a bit of a zero sum game that's going on there. Then you're incentivized to use whatever tricks you can, and in this case, this is the ultimate hack. For some reason, these filters hack people's dopamine and make them click those pictures as opposed to other pictures. So whether or not you really want to use these things, you are massively incentivized to do it, because if you don't, then all your opponent, all your competitors are going to get more attention. And so it creates this like sort of race to the bottom, essentially, where you end up sort of you sort of forces you, if you want to continue being competitive, you need to sacrifice more and more of your integrity and essentially, mislead your followers about your natural appearance. And so, yeah, that's one particular example that I made my first video about, because it's just so current and so salient.
And there are other instances of Moloch on social media. For example, we can think about extreme politics driving the most attention to specific people. We can think about short and intense videos that again attract a lot of attention, but perhaps is not the best for people's attention spans.
I love what Tristan Harris calls it. He calls it the race to the bottom of the brainstem, which is a lot of what social media is. It just seems like we found these like quirks of human dopamine. By and large, yes, people are being more entertained. If something is entertaining, they're more likely to click on it. But just because something's entertaining, it doesn't mean it's necessarily good for them. And if everyone is sort of doing this, then it's like encouraging, like the fact that video content is getting shorter and shorter and shorter. There are presumably negative externalities to this in the form of like, addiction, shortening attention spans. You can't get nuanced points across in a very short piece of content. But because of like the competitive incentives of the like social media game, we end up in that situation anyway.
Yeah. So, what is it specifically that makes it a Moloch type situation? Is it the fact that for each participant in the game, it's rational for them to use the beauty filter or to do the shortest and most intense video possible? But if everyone does that, then everyone is worse off. Would that be an accurate summary of the Moloch situation?
Yeah, exactly. That's a very good summary of it. You can think of it as whenever people optimize for winning a sort of short-term, like narrow goal at the cost of the long-term whole. So to put it into like economics terms, it's when you fail to internalize the externalities of the competitive process that you are playing. So sometimes like market failures can be the case. Pollution is another good example. You have a bunch of clothing factories that are in India, and they're all trying to get by. They're all kind of competing against each other. The profit margins are kind of thin. Everyone is incentivized to, let's say, they could be responsible and make sure that they don't pollute the rivers that they're sitting on by putting in expensive filtration systems, for example. But if they're operating on such tight profit margins, and the sort of checks and balances system is very lax, which is often the case in a lot of industries, then each individual factory owner is incentivized to just like actually quietly pollute into the river, because they'll be saving money on that. And especially then if they know, if one looks down the road and sees that one's doing it, it's like, well, we might as well do it, and so on. And so the cycle sort of continues. Yeah, so that would be an example of like failing to capture the externalities of sort of the competition that they're playing in. They get all the upsides of the profits and outsource to the like wider commons the costs of that game that they're in, essentially.
And when we begin, or at least when I began thinking about Moloch, it begins showing up everywhere. So it generalizes far beyond social media. It shows up, for example, in science too, where you're incentivized to get the maximum amount of citations for your papers as you possibly can. And this perhaps citations is not exactly what is not exactly equal to the most insightful papers, and so you're incentivized to game the system to get a lot of citations, but perhaps that doesn't produce the greatest science. So that's a potentially massive problem also.
Right. It's a bit of like a Godhart's law thing.
The moment you set up a specific metric for something, you open that metric up to being gamed by people, and it begins to diverge from what you're trying to capture with that metric.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, Godhart's law, which is like when a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure. Like that's an example of that, right? But, the measure is the number of citations is one way of measuring how quality a scientific paper is. That's the way what a journal might look at. But then once everyone starts optimizing for that, they're not actually optimizing for science anymore, and so it's no longer actually a good measure. It sort of like corrupts what the original goal was.
What is the difference between normal competition among people to try to produce the best social media video or the best scientific paper, and then these Moloch situations? Isn't what we're describing here simply competition?
Competition is actually like a more fundamental thing, and that it's a form of interaction, just like you have cooperation, coordination, etc. And competition is actually just a neutral thing. It just depends on the situation in which it plays out and the actors, the agents within it who are playing it. So, like a tennis game, people often think of most competitions, oh, it's like a zero sum thing, right? One person's win is another person's loss. True zero sum can only actually happen in theory. Like if we play a game of chess or tennis at the end of this session, at the end of this recording, we might become better friends, we might get fitter or smarter, we might get better at chess. There's always, because things are causally connected in this universe, there will always be some kind of externality. And the question is that externality positive or negative? And Moloch, at least in my definition, Moloch is essentially the god of negative sum competition. In other words, when competition is unhealthy and makes the world a worse place for having existed in the first place, just as it can also be a very positive thing. There are many instances of competition being very beneficial for society. I mean, arguably a lot of capitalism, right? Like capitalism is compared to something like communism like embraces competition deeply, as a main mode of interaction between businesses or individuals, and that it has lifted more people out of poverty than any other economic model, like massively. It's driven innovation at a far faster rate than we've ever seen before. Let's put it this way: I would much rather live today on a like low to medium income than a king 300 years ago. Like my life outcomes are so much better because of all the innovations we've created by and large through capitalism. But with all forms of competition, if they're not paid attention to, they can end up in a very negative direction. Oh, another example of competition being helpful is even like in science. So I remember going to CERN a few, back when they were trying to, I think they'd just done the Higgs boson discovery. But I remember being fascinated about the fact that they had actually had different teams working on the Large Hadron Collider, competing teams of scientists racing against each other to be the first to discover the existence of the Higgs boson, which was like, oh, this is unusual. Normally, I thought science is purely a collaborative affair, but actually, no. They were harnessing the power of competition to essentially force each other to up their game, and it was a really successful model. So, with smart enough design of the game in the first place, competition can be enormously beneficial in all sorts of ways. But the trouble is that we don't necessarily design the system smartly. A lot of the systems we are in have we've bumbled our way into through sort of kind of random evolutionary processes and coming from all kinds of weird starting conditions that didn't have any intention behind the design.
And perhaps that's a key point right there, because this might explain why it is that we can't just refuse to play the game, or we can't just spot which situations are negative sum and then not engage in them, because we already exist in a world with a lot of systems, and so we are in a sense forced to engage with many of these systems that have these Moloch type dynamics. What I'm thinking of here is, for example, if you start a social media account, or if you start a career as a scientist, well, then it's very difficult to try to change that system, and if the system you're working within, and if you try to do it, you will pay a price individually. And so, Liv, how do you think about changing these systems?
Um, yeah, that's the like the quadrillion-dollar question. There's sort of two ways you can. Well, okay, when it comes to like systems design, there have been instances where you get a sort of critical mass of people to appreciate that the system is broken that they're in. Like take the publication crisis in science, right, where you have all the sort of prestige locked up in a small handful of journals that are able to sort of dictate exactly how science is done, but that then like comes at the cost of, like Elsevier or whatever their name is, that own so many of the science journals. They don't pay the scientists that produce the work. And then they charge everybody, including the public, to be able to even view the scientific journals. But because if you're a scientist and you want your work to be, if you want to get funding in the first place, you have to prove that you're able to get published in one of the main journals. So they've kind of got this like weird prestige capture of the system that in many ways is just like, they're this like weird body that is like extracting so much money out of the system. They have some of the highest profit margins in the world of like major companies. It's quite astonishing. And it's incredible. Like, there's no way for any individual actor within it, any individual scientist to like change the game. But that said, if they can make enough awareness of it, and I've seen like movements happen. I'm trying to think of like a specific example of one that was very successful. But if they got like 52% of scientists to all come together and be like, you know what, this is really bullshit. Like, we want open source journals from now on. Like, we science knowledge should be free to the world, or at least much cheaper. At least not $30 per journal or whatever it is to like read this stuff. That would be a way. So like finding a way to coordinate. But the trouble is with like molecule systems, they're often by definition like almost basically impossible to coordinate in. An example I always like to give of like a really classic one is like a stadium full of people. Let's say you're at a football game or a rock concert or something, and everyone is sitting down. When the game begins, and everyone's got roughly a sort of equal view because it's like an angled thing. So you've got like this much view. But then a few people near the front decide that they want an even better view, because if they stand up, they can now see, wow, they can see even further, because they're above everyone else's head so much. So they stand up, and then that forces the people behind them. Well, now if they want to sort of continue playing the game, in this case, like just continue watching the game, they also have to stand up, but that affects people behind them and so on. And so eventually, like almost everyone ends up standing because of the actions of a few people at the front. Because it's so loud and there's like thousands of people, it's almost impossible to get everyone to coordinate and sit back down again. So that's an example of like just a really flawed system that is incredibly vulnerable to the sort of selfish actions of just a very small number of competitors within it, to like sort of cause the whole thing to sort of like crumble down into this like lower shitty state. Because the thing is, once everyone is standing up, no one's actually now got a better view than they had before comparatively, but they're all in a worse state because now they have to stand for the next 3 hours. So it's like a new equilibrium. They were in a sort of Nash equilibrium before that was unstable, and now they're in a new Nash equilibrium, but it's just worse than the one before. It's like what you would call, Eliezer Yudkowsky wrote a really cool book on this called Inadequate Equilibria, which is just like basically a list of just like really shitty examples, shitty equilibria within our civilization, within our society, that we're kind of stuck in, and that it's almost impossible to coordinate out of in order to get to where we would be better off.
What's so devilish about these Moloch type situations is that it doesn't require that the participants are dumb. It doesn't require that the participants are evil. It's simply it feels almost like you're being forced into doing something that you deep down know is bad. With your example with the stadium where you're incentivized to stand up, for example.
Right. You know the people, you know you're screwing the people over behind you, but at the same time, you're being screwed if you don't stand up. And it's like, well, what am I going to do? We're all going to end up there. Same thing with the beauty filters. I don't want, I didn't want to use them, but if I don't, I'm getting, left sort of a left behind, or like even more, perhaps a better example is like a model, a professional model, she does beauty shoots and it became the norm 20 years ago when Photoshop existed to like have your photos retouched. And even if she's like really morally against this, she's like, no, you're like airbrushing my skin so much it doesn't even look real. If she refuses, the photographers or the company or whoever will just hire another model that will, and so she'll be literally out of work. So if she wants to work, then she has to do it. Doesn't mean she's evil. It's just like the setup, the game is evil.
And then there's this question of how did we stumble into all of these systems that are not optimal for all of the people who are participating in these systems? Could we start new systems? If we can't reform the systems we have, could we potentially start new ones?
Potentially, yes. And in many cases, I think we're gonna have to. But like when it comes to like the really big ones, like our market failures, for example, where we've got, because right now certain capitalistic industries are not doing a good job of internalizing their externalities. But at the same time, like I don't think we can just like tear it all down and start again. Like we clearly can't do that. It's just way beyond our scope, and that tearing down process may be even more disruptive, deadly, than if we just left it going. So that would be, with those kind of problems, you kind of have to do these. And that's where you need like a bit more like centralization, like for example, some smarter rules. Like if you can if you could properly price the cost of polluting the air or polluting the water, then that would internalize those externalities and force those companies to actually not do the sort of shitty defection thing. But yeah, in terms of like in an ideal world, we would sort of redesign the system so that you're not having to sort of slap these band-aid solutions on. And then of course there's the other approach, which is like making people sort of essentially less selfish, because a lot of time people do stuff where they just, it's not because again they're meaning to be even selfish. It's just they're not even aware that they're producing externalities. They're not aware that they're polluting the commons or whatever, or they're not aware that they're in this like race to the bottom spiral. And that's sort of what the tactic I'm taking in like making these videos and so on, and like trying to make them as like digestible to a really really wide audience. Because I see a lot of people, particularly with like the political division and everything that's sort of getting worse and worse. There's so much of that is coming from people thinking that it's all the other side's fault. If people can learn to sort of take it a wider step out and realize that it's actually the system, the let's call it the clickbait industrial complex, for example. Realize that that's actually the real enemy here. Yes, sure, the other side, they still do stuff you don't like and so on, but if you could get out of the haze of the clickbait industrial complex and see the other side for like actually the points that they're at, instead of seeing this like really perverse like villainified version that the media show you, it would reduce so much of that. So trying to get people to appreciate that like what the true enemy is another approach, through awareness. And so in those instances where people do at least have somewhat of a choice to not do the selfish action, or at least be aware of doing it, then that would also mitigate and slow down the problem.
So on the individual side, you have this nice counterpoint to Moloch. Another, what do you call it? Moloch is a demon. What is WinWin?
Yeah. So, well, yeah. So, I've been dressing up as Moloch and so on, which after a while starts to get a little bit like icky. And I was thinking, okay, so if Moloch is the god of negative sum games, what's the inverse of that? What's the anti-Moloch? Who's the god of positive sum games, of win-win situations? And I couldn't basically think of a better name than win-win. Well, I started calling it win-win as a like sort of, okay, that's like its working title. But the more I kept thinking of it, the more it just stuck. And now I actually just really love the name because it's super simple. It's not like overly fancy, but what it is at its core is it's something that loves both coordination and cooperation. It definitely supports, whereas Moloch hates that. Like, ugh, it recoils from the idea of people getting along and coordinating and working together on a common goal. So it loves that, but it also loves pockets of competition. It loves to have a game. It likes, when there's space to do it and the externalities are properly accounted for, it will love a nice, healthy competition, just like, they had at CERN. So it's not like, as gods go, it's not like it doesn't take itself too seriously. It's not like all somber and like, oh, you must, follow me. It's like it's just like down to party, and it loves a good positive sum game. And another thing, I try and avoid calling it the anti Moloch, because in reality, it's that would put it on like the same level as Moloch, and it's something higher dimensional than that. Just by Moloch is because it can only operate in the realm of competition, whereas WinWin can operate in competition and coordination. And sometimes it's even so smart and wise. It can even like let go on. Okay, fine, have your little negative sum game right there. Yeah, go for it. But then it is able to notice when that negative sum game is getting a little too big and slap it down. So it's the boss of Moloch.
And this is just a way of thinking in our heads about which games we are playing in life. Are we playing games that involve Moloch? Are we playing games that involve WinWin? How have you found this personally useful to think in these terms?
Yeah, I mean, the way it sort of has personally helped me is, well, first of all, like if I'm trying to decide, oh, should I carry on doing videos? Maybe I should start a company. Maybe I should do something else. The first thing I now ask myself is like, well, okay, what are the externalities of this going to be? Is this what win-win would do? So that as a sort of starting point, and I'm not to say that I can perfectly model what win-win would do, far from it, but just as a practice question, as a question that I will ask myself before I undertake something. But another way it's been very helpful for me personally is I've always been an incredibly competitive person, like to the point of almost pathological when I was a teenager. Like I had to be the best at sports. I would want to know what my friends got in exams to know, was my percentage, was my grade higher? And this was, in some ways that can be helpful because it can give you the impetus to work harder and so on. But looking back on it, like I know that it was unhealthy because it would also give rise to jealousy. Like if someone did better than me, I would actually feel bad, which is deeply Molochy, very, very Molochy. Win-win would be like, good for you, you did well, great. Oh, I'm also going to use that as an incentive to work harder. But they would truly, Win-win feels deep compersion and joy at someone else's success, whereas Moloch definitely does not. And since I've sort of like built this a vision of this character in my mind, and like I try and emulate it whenever possible, and I found it's made me just I now have a much healthier relationship with competition. If I see if someone goes out and starts their own win-win thing, I will truly feel good about it because it's like, great, this is a positive meme, this is a race to the top, more win-win stuff everywhere. Whereas I think old me would have been like, it's my thing. So yeah, that's how it's like personally helps me basically.
So what we're talking about here is simply understanding the incentives that we are working under and understanding how important it is to look at the incentives you're operating within, because they will shape you in ways that you perhaps don't fully understand. And that's on the individual level. Is there anything to say about the systems level or the societal level? What could we do to have better incentives, to have less Moloch and more win-win? That's a very broad question, I know, but is there anything you've come across that's interesting there?
Yeah, I mean, again, it's really hard, and I don't have the answer to this. I mean, my first port of call would be to recommend who I think are like they're really good systems thinkers and are actively working on incentive design. Some examples are Ezra Raskin and Tristan Harris at Center for Humane Technology. Particularly through looking at these problems, how they manifest in Silicon Valley technology. And then also Jordan Hall and Daniel Schmachtenberger, who are sort of coming from an even broader perspective, from like a really philosophical background. They are some of the best thinkers on that. But to try and throw in my 2 cents, I think, at least for the time being, it's not a fully complete. It's not again. It's more of like a temporary band aid solution to these problems. But things like having nuclear weapons treaties have historically, they've probably kept us alive in the last few decades. We probably wouldn't be here if we didn't have some kinds of treaties, like really strong international norms against the use of nuclear weapons. While they're not completely fixing, they're not making nuclear weapons go away. They are at least buying us time to figure out the solutions to these like tricky game theoretic dilemmas. Um, so yeah, having stronger norms, like basically where people where society has a better immune system against defectors, whether it's through social punishment, actual, restrictions or whatever. That's definitely a good starting point. Yeah, the other thing I would say is, like the reason why I'm like trying to raise awareness of this issue is because we need as many smart people to understand the nature of the problem that we're in. That we're in like basically an incentive design problem. And the more smart people, put their minds to that, as opposed to figuring out how to like extract more dollars on the margin of whatever thing they're trading, or then the faster we will come to a better solution of this. So yeah, hope that kind of answers it.
So maybe a question here to just turn it around on itself is to ask, how do we incentivize people to think about our incentive design? Is there anything we could do here? Should we have prizes for coming up with the best incentive designs? Yes.
That's a good idea. Hadn't considered that. Yeah, like the annual WinWin prize. Who came up with the best cool new positive sum competition, that aligns the incentives of the individual with the whole. That's actually a really cool idea because I don't think we have, we've got like analogous ones, like, the Nobel Prize, right? That is awarding someone who has expanded the frontier of human knowledge, which is definitely a win-winny action. That's an example of like incentive, like you're providing some form of competition. People are competing for a Nobel Prize to an extent, but it's with the thoroughly positive externalities. But we haven't got one that is explicitly saying this, that is explicitly about like systems design and incentive design on really hard coordination problems. Like whoever ends up fixing coordination problems for good deserves the prize of all prizes. That is the ultimate universal prize, at least from my perspective. So yeah, that would be one way.
Do you actually think there is such a solution? Do you think coordination problems are solvable in a fully general sense, or is it something that will always be with us just because there are limited resources in the universe, almost no matter how wealthy we become?
Definitely, Moloch thrives on scarcity. You take away scarcity, it's going to be really hard for it to get its teeth into anything. So all the while we have some degree of scarcity of something that people want, then there we'll probably see coordination problems arise, and we'll see race to the bottoms arise. So my logical brain says no, we can't, but my intuition says that actually we can. I think Win-Win would be like, oh, we can absolutely solve this. So I'm gonna throw that out there too.
What's an area of research that you would be most excited about in terms of incentives design? So we've mentioned social media, we've mentioned science, we've mentioned nuclear weapons. What's something that's extraordinarily important, and you would like people to research from the incentive design perspective?
Well, the one that's most on my mind right now is the AI arms race because we're really watching that play out right before our eyes right now, where certain labs are being more Moloch-y than others. They're all in a competition for funds, for market share, for talent. They all want to have the best researchers and developers, and so they're all in this again, and they're all playing the game of like they're all facing the moral dilemma of like, oh, I probably this model isn't quite ready to release. I probably shouldn't release it to the general public yet. But if we don't, then those guys are going to do theirs first, and so on. So it's another classic example of this. And I personally think that it's something we need to turn down the competition dial. on the, I would love for us to develop super intelligence, and I think AI could be one of the best things that we ever invent. It's might even help us solve coordination problems. But at the same time, right now, Moloch is getting into the development of it, and that is a really big problem, arguably the biggest problem that we're facing, and we've got a lot of big ones. So if people can put their minds to that, how do we improve through coordination between the different competitors, essentially trying to race to build AI? How do we develop better norms to incentivize these labs and companies for to not defect, to actually make it so that alignment is more closer to to progress, or at least, yeah, I don't know. That is definitely the most pressing manifestation of Moloch in our world right now. And I think the more people who can put their minds to it, the better our chances are of solving, if not just mitigating it.
How much is humanity leaving on the table in terms of gains we could have if we could avoid all of these Moloch type situations? How much better could the world be if we could coordinate in a more healthy way?
A lot. I can't quantify that, but the answer will be in like multiples, presumably, of world GDP. Just because there's just so many, it's just making so many inefficiencies. And again, just like we're getting to the stage now where we are literally able to alter the climate of the planet that produced us, and we need. We've built weapons that are so powerful that they could literally destroy everybody on Earth. There's so much that's essentially like value. It's like negative value that we're producing that we could get rid of and like add into our future light cone, that could lead into potentially millennia of human flourishing, or whatever our descendants are, whether they're digital or natural. It just seems like an absolute tragedy that we are not putting all of our minds to figuring out how to solve, how to gain control of our evolutionary path. Because right now we are not in control of our own evolution, of our own destiny. Individually we might be able to control our little lives to an extent, but as a collective, we're not doing a particularly good job of that. But I think we can if we just put our minds to it.
What do you mean by by us not controlling our evolution as a species?
Well, it just seems like we we're just sort of following along with whatever incentives that have been dangled before us. We're still operating on the same wetware that we had 150,000 years ago, more or less. And while our brains are incredible, clearly they the landscape in which they are operating is so fundamentally different to what it was back then. We're just like clearly a little bit out of our depth. Even the most ardent accelerationists, I think, are aware that there are some things that like could be dangerous, and are like, whoa, okay. If we don't make a conscious effort to like build the morality, but figure out what like values and principles we want to go into our technology, and instead do it the other way around and let technology just build the technology first and then see what arises from it, then we're not in control of our own destiny. Like technology is driving us, the wheels are driving us, and to some extent, therefore, Moloch is driving us. We need to sort of reverse that stack. Like a good friend of mine described, Moloch as like if you let technology drive social structures, which then drive memes, that's where you get Moloch, because technology is not values neutral. It can absolutely affect what philosophies and principles we have if we don't consciously guide it. And WinWin is the other way around. Come up with your values, come up with your memes, let them give rise to human social structures that are like honoring those things. And from there, build the technologies that you need to better, like, make your lives better. So we just need a little bit more conscious intention behind the technologies that we build. We don't just, do it because we think it's going to be most profitable or get us the most fame.
What do you say to the people who are not interested in it, in trying to slow down and trying to think about how we want to steer technology? What do you think of the people who are simply interested in accelerating technology as much as possible? How do they fit into this whole social structure and incentive structure?
The divergence between what it seems like the views are between, for example, AI alignment and the AI accelerationist. I don't think the divergence is much as either side think. The vast majority of AI alignment people I know would like to see AGI exist. They would like technology to exist and for it to be as democratized as possible. Like I think it'd be horrifying to have some like centralized world cabal controlling it. Like that's a surefire way towards tyranny. Like that needs to be avoided. But at the same time, unfettered, like screw the externalities, just build whatever comes, blah blah blah, full steam ahead without any like real attempts to align it with keeping a biosphere alive is also devastating. So we need some third option. So that third option will come from the synthesis of these two groups. Like I think if they hive mind together, there will be the third option where it's, we get these amazing technologies that we deserve to have and we should have, and that they are not vulnerable to authoritarianism and tyranny. What I personally love about like the accelerationist crew is like they have so much optimism about the future. And I think that is sorely needed. It's really, really cool. That the weakness in their argument is that it seems to be based more on vibes sometimes, as opposed to like actual solid understanding of how the alignment problems work. But that's fine. Everyone has a gap in knowledge, and everything is learnable. And again, like that optimism is incredibly important to drive the alignment people to keep working on the thing. And I think there's so much like low hanging fruit between like knowledge sharing and information sharing between the two groups. They might appear at odds, but in reality, they're not. And I think if actually that's also part of the problem of like they communicate mostly through the internet, and internet is inherently like information lossy and dehumanizing. If they could actually just get in a room together and like talk, they realize they actually have very similar goals. Or at least like they're not perfectly aligned, but they're much closer aligned than it may appear through Twitter.
So you would encourage them to cooperate, and perhaps they could get to a win-win situation.
Exactly. Yes.
Great. That's a great way to end it, Liv. Thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thank you.